The morning sun painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and red when Running Wolf opened his eyes for the last time in his own bed. He was 28 years old, a respected warrior of the Chiricahua Apache, and today would mark the end of everything he had ever known. The year was 1886, and the American cavalry had been hunting his people across the harsh landscapes of Arizona and New Mexico for months. Running Wolf lived in a traditional wickiup made of oak poles and covered with brush and hides. His wife, Morningstar, was already awake, grinding corn for their morning meal. Their 2 children, a boy of 7 summers and a girl of 5, slept peacefully on their woven mats. The family had been moving constantly for weeks, always staying one step ahead of the soldiers who seemed to appear from every direction. The Apache camp consisted of about 300 people, including warriors, women, children, and elders. They had chosen this remote canyon in the Dragoon Mountains because it offered protection from 3 sides and had a reliable water source. The rocky walls rose high above them, creating natural fortifications that had served Apache families for generations. Ancient pictographs decorated the stone faces, telling stories of hunts and battles from long ago. Chief Naiche, son of the famous Cochise, had called a council meeting for that morning. The situation was becoming desperate. Food was running low, and the women could barely gather enough wild plants and roots to feed everyone. The men had not been able to hunt properly, because any smoke from cooking fires might give away their position to the cavalry scouts who seemed to be everywhere. Running Wolf was known among his people for his exceptional skills as a tracker and his ability to move silently through the desert. He had earned his name as a young boy when he successfully tracked a wounded wolf for 3 days through rocky terrain that would have challenged even experienced hunters. His father had been a respected medicine man, and Running Wolf carried some of that spiritual knowledge, though he had chosen the path of a warrior instead. The tensions between the Apache and the white settlers had been building for decades. Gold had been discovered in Apache territory, and more people kept coming from the east, demanding land and protection from the government. The Apache had signed treaties before, but the white men always seemed to want more. Each agreement led to smaller reservations and more restrictions on where the Apache could travel, hunt, and practice their ancient ways. Running Wolf remembered better times when his people could move freely across the vast desert, following the seasons and the game. They had traded with Mexican villages to the south and maintained complex relationships with other tribes. The Apache had never been farmers like some tribes, but were masters of surviving in the harsh desert environment that others found impossible to endure. As Running Wolf prepared his weapons that morning, he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. His medicine bag, given to him by his father, seemed to pulse with unusual warmth against his skin. The Apache believed in signs and omens, and everything about this day felt different. The birds were too quiet, and even the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the canyon walls. Morningstar noticed her husband's thoughtful mood as she handed him his morning meal. She had been married to Running Wolf for 8 years, and she could read his expressions like tracks in sand. Something was troubling him deeply. Beyond the usual worries about soldiers and survival, she reached out and touched his hand, offering silent support in the way of their people. The other warriors were also preparing for what everyone knew might be their final stand. Ammunition was running dangerously low, and their horses were tired from constant travel. Some of the older men spoke quietly about the possibility of surrender, but most of the younger warriors, including Running Wolf, would rather die fighting than live confined on a reservation. Running Wolf picked up his rifle, a Winchester he had taken from a cavalry soldier in a previous battle. He checked his knife, made sure his war paint was properly applied, and said a silent prayer to the spirits of his ancestors. He kissed his sleeping children on their foreheads and embraced his wife, knowing in his heart that he might never see them again. The council meeting was about to begin, and decisions would be made that would determine the fate of everyone in the camp. Running Wolf walked toward the gathering place, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. Behind him, Morningstar watched with tears in her eyes, somehow knowing that this day would change everything forever. Chief Naiche stood in the center of the circle as the warriors gathered around him. His weathered face showed the strain of leading his people through these impossible times. At 36 years old, he carried the heavy responsibility of being Cochise's son, and everyone looked to him for guidance. The morning air was crisp and smoke from the small council fire drifted upward between the canyon walls. "My brothers," Nietzsche began, his voice carrying the authority of generations of Apache leaders. "The bluecoats are closing in from all directions. Our scouts report at least 500 soldiers moving toward our position. General Miles has brought more troops than we have ever seen before." Running Wolf listened carefully as other warriors shared what they had observed. Two Hawks, an experienced scout, had seen cavalry units approaching from the north and east. They were still 2 days away, but they were moving with purpose and seemed to know exactly where the Apache camp was located. Someone had betrayed their position, or perhaps the soldiers had finally learned to read Apache sign as well as the Apache themselves. The discussion grew heated as different options were presented. Some of the older warriors argued for immediate flight deeper into Mexico, where they might find safety among the Sierra Madre Mountains. Others wanted to split the group into smaller bands that could scatter in different directions, making it harder for the cavalry to track them all. The youngest warriors, including Running Wolf, favored making a stand and fighting with everything they had. Geronimo, the most famous war leader among them, spoke with the passion that had made him legendary. Though he was in his 50s, his eyes still burned with fierce determination. "I will not run anymore," he declared. "I will not watch our children grow up as prisoners, learning the white man's ways and forgetting who they are. Better to die free than live as slaves." Running Wolf felt his heart stir at these words. He had seen what happened to Apache who surrendered. They were sent to distant places like Florida, where the climate was wrong and many died of diseases their bodies could not fight. The children were taken away to schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache and were punished for following their traditional ways. As the council continued, a young boy came running into the circle. He was breathing hard and his eyes were wide with fear. "Soldiers," he gasped. "Many soldiers coming up the South Trail. They will be here before the sun reaches the middle of the sky." The camp exploded into action. The cavalry had moved faster than anyone expected, and there was no time for the careful planning they had hoped to do. Women began gathering essential supplies while trying to keep the children calm. The warriors checked their weapons one final time and prepared to defend their families and their way of life. Running Wolf ran back to his wickiup where Morningstar was already packing their few precious possessions. She had wrapped their children in warm blankets and was preparing to carry their youngest on her back. The 7-year-old boy, Little Hawk, looked up at his father with trust and confusion in his dark eyes. "Will we have to run again, Father?" Little Hawk asked in Apache. Running Wolf knelt down and placed his hands on his son's shoulders. "You must be brave and help your mother," he said quietly. "Remember what I have taught you about being Apache. Never forget who you are, no matter what happens." Morningstar understood what her husband was really saying. The warriors would stay and fight to give the women and children time to escape. She had known this moment would come, but knowing did not make it easier. She pressed a small medicine bundle into Running Wolf's hands, something her grandmother had made many years ago. The sound of horses could now be heard echoing off the canyon walls. The cavalry was closer than anyone had thought possible. Running Wolf kissed his family goodbye and joined the other warriors who were taking positions among the rocks. They had chosen their defensive positions well, with clear fields of fire and protection from return shots. As Running Wolf found his position behind a large boulder, he could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions. The soldiers had surrounded the canyon just as the Apache had feared. There would be no escape for the warriors, but perhaps the women and children could find a way out through the narrow passages that only the Apache knew about. The war cries of his ancestors seemed to echo in Running Wolf's ears as he checked his rifle one last time. He thought about his father's teachings, about courage and honor, about living and dying as a free man. The morning sun was climbing higher, and shadows were growing shorter. Soon the battle would begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The first shots echoed through the canyon like thunder rolling across the desert. Running Wolf could see blue-uniformed soldiers positioning themselves on the rim above, their rifles glinting in the morning sunlight. Captain Henry Lawton led the main force, a veteran Indian fighter who had been pursuing Apache bands for years. Behind him rode nearly 300 cavalry troopers, each one determined to end this campaign once and for all. Running Wolf steadied his Winchester against the rock and took careful aim. His first shot dropped a soldier who had exposed himself too much while trying to get a better angle on the Apache positions. The man tumbled down the rocky slope, his rifle clattering against the stones. Other Apache warriors opened fire from their concealed positions, and the canyon filled with the sharp crack of gunshots and the echoes that bounced off the walls. The cavalry responded with overwhelming firepower. Bullets chipped pieces off the rocks where the Apache warriors sheltered, sending stone fragments flying like tiny arrows. Running Wolf could hear the whine of lead passing close to his head as he moved from one position to another, always staying low and using every bit of cover the canyon provided. Behind the fighting line, the Apache women and children were making their desperate escape through a narrow passage that led to a hidden trail up the back wall of the canyon. Morning Star carried her daughter while Little Hawk followed close behind, his small hand gripping his mother's dress. The passage was so narrow that they had to move single file, and loose rocks threatened to give way under their feet. Geronimo had positioned himself where he could command the defense while watching for any chance to help his people escape. His rifle spoke again, and each shot seemed to find its target. Despite being outnumbered 10-1, the Apache warriors were making the soldiers pay dearly for every foot of ground they gained. Running Wolf saw a group of cavalry troopers trying to work their way around the left flank of the Apache position. If they succeeded, they would be able to attack from behind and trap the remaining warriors. He called out a warning to Two Hawks, who immediately understood the danger. Together they began moving through the rocks to counter this threat. The battle was turning into exactly what the Apache had feared. The soldiers had them surrounded and were slowly closing the circle. More troops appeared on the canyon rim, and Running Wolf could see others working their way up the main trail toward the camp. Soon there would be nowhere left to retreat, and the ammunition was running dangerously low. As Running Wolf fired his last few cartridges, he thought about the old stories his grandfather had told him about famous Apache warriors who had died fighting impossible odds. There was honor in such a death, his grandfather had said. Honor that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come. But Running Wolf was not ready to die yet, not while his family might still need him. A bullet struck the rock inches from his head, covering him with stone dust. When he wiped his eyes clear, he saw that several soldiers had made it to the bottom of the canyon and were advancing toward the Apache positions. Their blue uniforms stood out starkly against the red and brown of the desert landscape. These were experienced Indian fighters, and they moved with the caution of men who had learned to respect Apache warriors. Two Hawks suddenly cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where a cavalry bullet had found its mark. Running Wolf crawled over to help his friend, dragging him behind better cover. The wound was bleeding heavily and Two Hawks was growing pale from blood loss. He pressed his remaining ammunition into Running Wolf's hands and whispered, "Tell my wife I died fighting." The sound of gunfire was becoming more scattered as the Apache warriors were picked off one by one or forced to retreat to smaller positions. Running Wolf could see that Chief Nietzsche was still fighting from a strong position near the center of the camp, but even he was running low on ammunition. The plan had been to hold the soldiers long enough for the families to escape, but the cavalry had attacked faster and with more men than anyone had expected. Running Wolf looked toward the narrow passage where he had last seen his family disappearing. He hoped desperately that Morning Star and the children had made it to safety, but there was no way to know for sure. All he could do was continue fighting and hope that their sacrifice would give the women and children enough time to reach the hidden trails that led deep into the mountains. The sun was climbing higher, and the heat was beginning to build in the canyon. Sweat mixed with dust and gunpowder residue on Running Wolf's face as he prepared to make what might be his final stand. Around him the sounds of battle continued, but he could hear that fewer Apache rifles were still firing. Time was running out and the end was approaching faster than the desert wind. The cavalry charge came at midday when the sun was directly overhead and shadows offered little protection. Captain Lawton had grown tired of the slow advance and ordered a direct assault on the remaining Apache positions. 60 mounted troopers thundered down the main trail into the canyon, their sabers flashing in the brilliant sunlight and their voices raised in battle cries that echoed off the rock walls. Running Wolf had only 3 cartridges left for his Winchester. He made each shot count, bringing down one cavalry horse and wounding its rider before the mass of blue uniforms swept past his position. The Apache warrior rolled behind a fallen boulder as horses' hooves pounded the ground where he had been lying just moments before Chief Nietzsche stood up from his cover and, faced the charging cavalry with only a knife in his hand. His rifle was empty and there was no time to reload. Two soldiers rode directly at him, but the Apache chief moved with the fluid grace that had made his father famous. He ducked under one saber swing and pulled the trooper from his horse, fighting hand to hand until a pistol shot from another soldier ended his resistance. Running Wolf watched his chief fall and felt something break inside his chest. Nietzsche had been more than a leader. He had been the living connection to the great Apache past, to the days when Cochise had led their people with wisdom and strength. Now that connection was severed, and Running Wolf could feel the weight of loss settling over the battlefield like dust after a windstorm. Geronimo was still fighting from a position near the old ceremonial fire pit, his rifle empty but his spirit unbroken. 3 soldiers surrounded him, but the legendary war leader showed no sign of surrender. He had always said he would rather die fighting than live as a prisoner, and he was proving those words with his actions. When a cavalry officer called for him to give up, Geronimo responded by throwing his empty rifle at the man's head. The battle was nearly over, but a few Apache warriors continued to resist from scattered positions throughout the canyon. Running Wolf could hear sporadic gunfire and the shouts of soldiers as they searched for the last defenders. He crawled through a maze of rocks trying to reach a position where he might be able to help Geronimo, but soldiers seemed to be everywhere. As Running Wolf moved through the rocks, he came upon a terrible sight. Near what had been his own wickiup, he found the body of old Many Horses, an elder who had been too sick to travel with the women and children. The old man had died trying to protect some sacred objects that could not be abandoned. His wrinkled hand still gripped a ceremonial lance that had belonged to his grandfather. The sight filled Running Wolf with a rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. These soldiers were not just killing warriors. They were destroying everything that made the Apache people who they were. The sacred objects, the traditional homes, the burial places of ancestors, everything was being trampled under the boots and hooves of the invading army. From his new position, Running Wolf could see that some of the soldiers had found the trail the women and children had used to escape. A small group of cavalry troopers was following the narrow passage, and he realized with horror that his family might not have gotten away after all. The thought of Morning Star and the children being captured or killed gave him strength he did not know he still possessed. Running Wolf began moving toward the passage, no longer caring about his own safety. If soldiers were pursuing his family, he would stop them or die in the attempt. He climbed over rocks and squeezed through gaps that seemed too narrow for a man to pass, driven by desperation and love for his wife and children. Behind him, the sounds of battle were growing quieter. Fewer shots were being fired, and he could hear soldiers calling out orders as they searched the canyon for any remaining Apache fighters. Some troopers were already gathering Apache possessions and preparing to burn everything that could not be carried away. The smoke was beginning to rise from the first fires, carrying with it the smell of burning hides and wooden poles. As Running Wolf reached the entrance to the narrow passage, he paused to catch his breath and listen for sounds ahead. He could hear voices speaking in English and the sound of horses moving carefully over the rocky trail. The soldiers had indeed followed the escape route, and they were getting closer to the fleeing Apache families with every passing moment. Running Wolf checked his knife and prepared to follow the passage upward. He had no ammunition left, but he still had his strength and his determination to protect his family. Whatever happened next, he would face it as an Apache warrior, fighting to the end for the people he loved and the way of life that was disappearing like smoke in the desert wind. Running Wolf climbed through the narrow passage with the silence of a hunting cat, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. The trail was treacherous with loose stones that could betray his presence with a single misplaced step. Above him, he could hear the voices of cavalry troopers growing closer, their horses snorting and breathing hard from the difficult climb. The passage opened onto a narrow ledge that ran along the face of the canyon wall. From here, Running Wolf could see the soldiers below still searching through the Apache camp, setting fires and gathering anything of value. Thick black smoke was rising from multiple points, carrying away the last physical remnants of his people's free life in these mountains. As Running Wolf edged along the ledge, he spotted the cavalry patrol that had followed the escape trail. There were 8 soldiers, led by a young lieutenant who kept consulting a map and pointing in different directions. They had dismounted and were examining tracks in the soft earth, trying to determine which way the Apache families had gone from this point. Behind a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards ahead, Running Wolf caught a glimpse of blue cloth that made his heart race. It was Morningstar's dress, and he could see Little Hawk crouched beside her, both of them trying to stay hidden while keeping watch on their pursuers. His daughter was nowhere to be seen, and Running Wolf prayed that she was safely hidden somewhere nearby. The lieutenant was young and eager, probably fresh from West Point and determined to make his reputation fighting Indians. He ordered his men to spread out and search the area more thoroughly, convinced that the Apache families could not have gone far. 2 soldiers moved directly toward the trees where Morningstar and Little Hawk were hiding. Running Wolf knew he had to act quickly. 8 armed soldiers against 1 Apache with only a knife seemed like impossible odds. But he had surprise on his side, and the desperation of a father protecting his family. He studied the terrain, looking for any advantage he could use in the coming fight. The ledge where Running Wolf crouched was about 20 feet above the soldier's position. If he could reach the trees without being seen, he might be able to attack from behind and even the odds slightly. But the approach would require crossing open ground where he would be visible to anyone who looked up. As the 2 soldiers drew closer to his family's hiding place, Running Wolf made his decision. He could not wait any longer for a better opportunity. He gathered himself like a mountain lion preparing to pounce and dropped silently from the ledge, landing behind a large boulder that provided temporary cover. One of the soldiers heard something and turned around, his rifle ready. "Did you hear that, Murphy?" he called to his companion. Sounded like a rock falling. Running Wolf held his breath and pressed himself against the stone, knowing that discovery now would mean death for himself, and probably capture for his family. The soldier named Murphy was only a few feet from the trees now, and Running Wolf could see Little Hawk's frightened face peering through the branches. The boy was trying to be brave, but he was only 7 years old and the strain was showing in his dark eyes. Morningstar had one hand on her son's shoulder and the other clutching something to her chest, probably their baby daughter. "Lieutenant," Murphy suddenly called out, "I think I found something over here." He had spotted a piece of torn cloth caught on a low branch, evidence that someone had passed that way recently. The other soldiers began converging on the area, and Running Wolf knew his family would be discovered within moments. Running Wolf rose from behind the boulder and let out the piercing war cry that Apache warriors had used for generations to strike fear into their enemies' hearts. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The soldiers spun around in confusion, trying to locate the source of the terrifying sound. Before the echo died away, Running Wolf was among them like a desert whirlwind. His knife found the first soldier's throat before the man could raise his rifle. The second trooper managed to get off a shot, but it went wide as Running Wolf tackled him to the ground. The Apache warrior's blade flashed in the sunlight as he fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The other soldiers recovered from their initial shock and began firing, but they had to be careful not to hit their own men. Running Wolf used this confusion to his advantage, staying close to his opponents and using their bodies as shields. His movements were fluid and deadly, each strike calculated for maximum effect. The young lieutenant shouted orders, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice cracked with panic. This was not the type of warfare they had trained for at the military academy. This was personal combat, primitive and brutal, where civilization's rules meant nothing and only strength and will determined who would survive. Running Wolf fought like a man possessed, driven by love for his family and rage at everything his people had suffered. But even Apache courage had its limits, and he was still one man against many. A rifle bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and nearly knocking him down. Blood began to flow, weakening him with each heartbeat. The bullet wound in Running Wolf's shoulder burned like fire, but he continued fighting with desperate determination. 3 soldiers lay dead or wounded around him, but the remaining 5 had formed a circle and were closing in. The young lieutenant had drawn his pistol and was trying to get a clear shot without hitting his own men. Blood loss was making Running Wolf dizzy, and his movements were becoming slower. He could see Morningstar's face through the trees, her eyes wide with terror as she watched her husband fighting for their lives. Little Hawk had pressed his face against his mother's shoulder, unable to watch the violence but afraid to look away completely. "Surrender now, and we'll make it quick," the lieutenant shouted, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound authoritative. "You can't win against all of us." Running Wolf's only response was to shift his grip on his bloody knife and prepare for the final assault. He would not surrender, not while his family still had a chance to escape. The soldiers attacked together, trying to overwhelm him with numbers. Running Wolf managed to wound another trooper before a rifle butt caught him across the head, dropping him to his knees. Stars exploded behind his eyes and warm blood ran down his face from a gash in his scalp. Still, he tried to rise, driven by willpower alone. Two soldiers grabbed his arms while a third pressed a rifle barrel against his chest. The lieutenant approached carefully, his pistol aimed at Running Wolf's head. "That was quite a fight, Indian," he said, breathing hard. "But it's over now." The young officer was trying to sound confident, but his hands were shaking from the adrenaline of his first real combat. Running Wolf raised his head and looked directly at the lieutenant with eyes that showed no fear, only defiance. "It will never be over," he said in accented English. "As long as one Apache draws breath, we will fight for our freedom." The words came out slowly, each one requiring effort, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. The lieutenant seemed unsettled by the Apache warrior's steady gaze and unbroken spirit. He had expected to find a defeated savage, not this dignified man who faced death without flinching. "Where are the women and children?" he demanded. "Tell us and maybe we can work something out." Running Wolf almost smiled at the question. Did this young soldier really think an Apache warrior would betray his own family to save his life? "They are where you will never find them," he replied. "They are free, and they will remain free." He thought of the hidden trails that only his people knew, the secret places where Apache families could disappear like smoke. The soldiers were growing impatient, and their leader was clearly out of his depth. The lieutenant had read about Indian fighting in books, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of facing a man like Running Wolf. This Apache would rather die than give up information about his family, and that kind of courage was something the young officer had never encountered before. "Set up a fire," the lieutenant finally ordered, his voice harder now. "Maybe some heat will loosen his tongue." The soldiers began gathering dry brush and wood, building a pile near where Running Wolf knelt. The threat was clear, and everyone present understood what would happen next if the Apache warrior continued to refuse to cooperate. As the flames began to grow, Running Wolf thought about his father's teachings regarding death and honor. An Apache warrior should face the end with courage, showing enemies that they could destroy the body but never break the spirit. He began singing softly in his native language, a death song that his grandfather had taught him as a boy. The fire grew higher, and the heat began to reach Running Wolf's face. Through the dancing flames he could see Morningstar still hiding in the trees with Little Hawk. His wife's face was streaked with tears, but she remained silent, knowing that any sound might give away their position to the soldiers. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment they said goodbye without words. The soldiers forced Running Wolf closer to the fire, but his death song never wavered. His voice grew stronger instead of weaker, as if the approaching flames were feeding his spirit rather than destroying it. The lieutenant watched in growing amazement and discomfort as this Apache warrior transformed his own execution into an act of defiance and spiritual power. As the fire consumed him, Running Wolf's last thought was of his children growing up free in the mountains, carrying on the Apache way of life that no army could ever completely destroy. His final words, spoken clearly despite the flames, were directed at his hidden family. "Remember who you are. Remember always." Then the smoke and fire took him, and the death song of Running Wolf echoed one last time. Through the canyon where his people had made their final stand, the 300 riders of the plains had witnessed the death of a warrior who chose to burn rather than betray his family. In the years that followed, both Apache and cavalry troopers would tell the story of the man who died in fire before their eyes, whose courage in death became legend among all who had seen it.